I still remember the exact bite of the bitter winter wind in Boston the night my parents died. I was 8 years old. One day I had a family, a warm kitchen, and soft hands holding mine, and the next I was handed a small cardboard suitcase and sent away to a cold, crowded orphanage. If you have never known what it means to go to sleep with your stomach aching from hunger, wrapped in a blanket that smells of damp wool and cheap institutional bleach, you cannot possibly understand how deep that scar goes. It never truly fades. It sits right under your skin, whispering to you in the dark. For years, every single breath I took was fueled by a desperate, obsessive promise I made to myself. No child of mine will ever, ever know this cold. No child of mine will ever have to wonder where their next warm meal is coming from. When my husband passed away suddenly, just months after our son Ethan was born, that personal promise turned into an iron cage. I was left entirely alone with a wailing newborn, empty bank accounts, and a burning, relentless drive. I threw myself into work. I started from a tiny, drafty basement office and clawed my way up, building a multi-million-dollar real estate and tech enterprise from scratch, brick by grueling brick, working through every obstacle in my path. I worked 70, 80 hours a week, year after year, sacrificing my own youth. I missed school plays. I missed his first tentative steps. And I missed those quiet bedtimes reading stories. But I never, ever missed a chance to provide. Whenever Ethan looked at a toy in a storefront window, it was in his hands before he could even finish pointing at it. Whenever he wanted a luxury vacation, designer clothes, or the keys to a brand new car as he grew older, the check was signed instantly, without a second thought. And in those rare, quiet moments when I finally held him close at the end of an exhausting week, when little Ethan would wrap his small arms tightly around my neck, bury his sleepy face in my shoulder and whisper, "Mommy, thank you," my tired heart melted completely. In those sweet, precious moments, I believed every single sacrifice was worth it. I truly thought that protecting him from hardship meant giving him the world on a silver platter, shielding him from every sharp edge of life. When Ethan turned 22, he wanted to settle down with his girlfriend, Chloe. Naturally, as a loving mother who wanted to give her only child the moon and the stars, I wanted them to have the absolute best start possible in life. I didn't just help them out. I bought them a beautiful, sprawling $8 million estate outside Boston, a quiet place where they could build their future together. To keep things secure and protected from the unpredictable risks of the business world, I placed that property, along with several other commercial assets, inside a discreet, revocable family trust. Legally, I remain the sole trustee and owner of the trust. But to Ethan and Chloe, I never bothered to sit them down and spell out every single line of the legal fine print. I figured it didn't matter. In my mind, they were my flesh and blood. What was mine was eventually going to be theirs anyway, right? Why burden young people with complicated legal jargon and trust documents when they were just starting out in life? That was my fatal, heartbreaking error. I assumed that by giving my son an empire, I was teaching him security and giving him a head start. Instead, I was feeding a monster of absolute entitlement, letting him believe that everything in this world was simply owed to him. For the next 18 years, Ethan lived in that magnificent estate without ever worrying about the real world or the cost of living. He never paid for anything. Maintenance, insurance, taxes. He never saw a single bill cross his desk or had to worry about where the money came from. Money just flowed into his life like oxygen, invisible, effortless, and seemingly infinite. And slowly, subtly, day by day, the boy I had raised with so much blood, sweat, and sacrifice began to look at me differently. He stopped seeing me as the mother who bled to give him everything. Instead, he began to look right through me, treating me like an aging, invisible ATM machine whose only purpose in this world was to keep funding his effortless, luxurious lifestyle. If only I had known then what I know now. If only I had realized that the magnificent walls of that estate weren't protecting my son at all. They were locking him inside a prison of his own growing arrogance, while quietly digging a shallow grave for my own heart. Let me be clear about one thing right from the start. My son Ethan wasn't stupid. He wasn't some clueless toddler who didn't know how the world worked. He was sharp, articulate, and graduated from a reputable university. But raw intelligence doesn't protect you when you are marinating in unearned luxury from the exact moment you transition into adulthood. When Ethan met Chloe in his early 20s, she slid right into his world like a hand into a custom leather glove. Chloe was stunning, fiercely ambitious in all the wrong ways, and possessed an expensive taste that matched her sharp smile. When they decided to move into the $8 million estate I had set up, they didn't see it as a generous gift from a working mother who had clawed her way up from nothing. In their minds, that sprawling mansion was simply their baseline. It was where they rightfully belonged. For the next 18 years, that estate became a private theater of absolute, uninterrupted delusion. People often ask me how two grown adults could live in a massive property for nearly 2 decades without ever questioning who was actually footing the bill. The truth is simple. They didn't question it because they didn't want to. It is remarkably easy to blind yourself to reality when reality is heavy and expensive, while your own existence is entirely free. Every single month, while I was busy running my corporate offices and managing commercial real estate across the state, a completely automated financial rhythm played out in the background. Ethan never held a utility bill in his calloused hands, because his hands never had calluses. Everything was handled automatically through secure corporate accounts linked directly to my revocable family trust. He never paid tax, and he never saw a single invoice. Over those 18 years, I quietly spent more than $6 million supporting them, covering every single expense to ensure they never felt a financial pinch. $6.2 million paid out in absolute silence, without a single word of appreciation in return. And how did Ethan and Chloe handle this? Did they ever call me up to ask how I was managing all of that weight? Not once. In fact, the exact opposite happened. The longer they lived there, the deeper and more toxic their sense of entitlement grew, bleeding directly into every aspect of their daily lives. I remember one afternoon when I stopped by the estate with a stack of paperwork and a pile of newly arrived tax notices that had accidentally been routed to my home address. I found Ethan standing in the foyer on his phone. As I tried to hand him the envelope and gently suggest we sit down to talk about the mounting upkeep costs, he didn't even break his stride. He walked right past me without making eye contact, waved a dismissive hand, and spoke directly into his phone. "Yeah, Mom, just leave it on the counter. Hey, Mom, can you also transfer some extra money to my account today?" He didn't pause for an answer, completely blind to the reality of what was keeping his roof over his head. That blatant disregard bled into everything they did. They began hosting lavish weekend parties during the summer months. Someone once complimented the sprawling architecture and the immaculate grounds during a crowded gathering, whispering in awe about how successful Ethan must be at such a young age. Ethan smiled, swirling his imported wine, and said, "I've made some good investments." He let people believe that the mansion was entirely his own doing, a testament to his own corporate genius. Chloe stood right beside him, laughing and dismissing any casual questions about family assets as their early inheritance. They spent freely on high-end luxury cars, designer wardrobes, and spontaneous international vacations, all funded by the financial cushion I provided. Whenever their credit card balances spiked, a quiet transfer from the trust smoothed it over before they even had to check their bank balance. They weren't just living in my house. They were living inside a carefully constructed fantasy where they were the undisputed lords of the manor, and I was nothing more than an invisible machine designed to fuel their permanent vacation. I watched this transformation happen year after year from a distance, and every time I looked at them, a cold knot would form in my chest. I thought I was protecting my son from suffering, but looking back at those 18 years of silent subsidies, I realized something terrifying. I hadn't protected him at all. I had financed his arrogance and built the very pedestal from which he would eventually look down on me with total disdain. When I turned 58, a quiet, persistent exhaustion finally caught up with me. After decades of grinding away at corporate offices, fighting off competitors, and managing commercial real estate from dawn until midnight, my soul was simply tired. I didn't care about expanding my portfolio anymore. I just wanted family. I wanted to pack a single suitcase, move into that grand $8 million estate with my son Ethan and his wife Chloe, and spend my final working years surrounded by the people I had bled to support. I naively believed that living under the same roof would bridge the gap, that I would finally get to experience the simple, warm family dinners I had missed out on all those years. I couldn't have been more wrong. From the very first week I crossed that threshold, my presence wasn't treated like a mother coming home to rest. It was treated like an inconvenient piece of luggage dropped in the middle of a modern living room. The warmth I had dreamed of was replaced by icy stares and heavy, suffocating silences. To Ethan and Chloe, my quiet presence in the house was an obstruction to their daily freedom. I wasn't their mother or an honored guest. I was an aging, cumbersome burden cramping their lifestyle. Chloe would heave heavy, dramatic sighs whenever I walked into the kitchen, acting as if my breathing alone was an insult to her morning routine. Ethan, the boy I had shielded from every sharp edge of the world, stopped looking me in the eye altogether. He was too busy, too important, and too visibly annoyed that an older woman was occupying space in his domain. And then the relationship crossed that terrifying line from cold indifference into active, malicious cruelty. It started with small, passive-aggressive digs. Remarks dropped over dinner about how older people take up too much space, how houses like theirs need to be uncluttered, how modern life has no room for slow-moving baggage. But the true breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, precisely when Ethan thought I was out of the house running errands at the bank. I had forgotten my umbrella in the foyer and slipped back through the side patio entrance. As I stepped down the short hallway toward the kitchen, I heard low, urgent voices coming from the den. I froze in my tracks. What I heard next cut straight through my ribs like a cold blade. They weren't talking about how to make me comfortable in my old age. They were planning my eviction from my own family. Chloe's voice was sharp, cutting right through the quiet hum of the house. "We can't keep living like this," she hissed, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. "She's slowing down, she's getting underfoot, and she's taking up the guest wing we desperately need for our friends this weekend. Just put her in that state-funded senior facility downtown. It's cheap, it's entirely out of the way, and nobody in our social circle ever has to know. And my son, my flesh and blood, the boy I had spent 18 years shielding from every hardship life had to offer, let out a casual, agreeing sigh. Yeah, you're totally right, Chloe. Call them tomorrow morning. Let's just get it over with so we can have our space back. My knees went weak. The air vanished from my lungs. But the shock of hearing my own son trade me away like an old piece of furniture was nothing compared to the physical horror that awaited me upstairs. 10 minutes later, walking up the grand double staircase with a heavy heart, I noticed my bedroom door was wide open. 2 large black plastic trash bags sat right in the middle of the plush white carpet. My clothes, my winter coats, everything I had brought with me from my apartment had been roughly ripped off their hangers and shoved inside. They hadn't even waited for tomorrow. They had already started packing me away like trash. My hands shaking, I walked slowly down the back hallway toward the dark, damp storage room underneath the basement stairs, the place where they kept broken lawn chairs and empty shipping boxes. And there, sitting right on top of a dusty plastic bin, was a small cardboard box containing my personal history. Atop the pile sat the silver frame photograph of my late husband, Ethan's father, along with my old leather photo album and a delicate gold bracelet he had slipped onto my wrist on our wedding day, tossed aside carelessly because Chloe needed drawer space for her new designer accessories. I stood there in the shadows of that cold storage room, looking at my whole life stuffed into garbage bags. And in that quiet, agonizing second, the final stubborn illusion shattered completely. I kept asking myself one single agonizing question. When had my son stopped seeing me as his mother? When had love and sacrifice turned into an absolute toxic expectation? As I stared down at my late husband's photograph and my wedding bracelet buried beneath the trash, the sadness inside me didn't break me. It hardened into cold, absolute steel. They wanted me gone? Fine. But they were about to find out whose roof they were actually standing under. Some people think that when a mother realizes her own flesh and blood is trying to throw her away like broken furniture, she immediately breaks down in tears, screams in the hallway, and begs for mercy. They expect a theatrical shouting match, plates flying, or a dramatic family showdown where everyone airs their dirty laundry. But they don't know who I am, and they certainly don't understand how the real world operates. Decades in the corporate trenches, fighting tooth and nail to build a multi-million-dollar real estate enterprise entirely from dust, taught me one vital rule. Never throw a childish punch when you can file a single legal document that ends the entire match before it even begins. I didn't storm down the stairs screaming at Ethan and Chloe. I didn't cry. I didn't throw their designer suitcases back at them. And I didn't lower myself to a petty shouting match. Instead, I walked back down to my temporary room, quietly packed my actual belongings into my sleek leather weekender bag, walked out to my car, and drove straight through the rainy Boston traffic downtown to my private corporate office. Before meeting with legal counsel, I needed to face the core of it all on my own terms. I walked into my private office, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and walked straight to the wall safe hidden behind a framed oil painting. My fingers entered the private combination with mechanical precision. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft metallic click. Inside sat the original master deeds, the foundational trust documents, and a small silver frame photograph of Ethan when he was just 6 years old, smiling brightly with a gap-toothed grin. I picked up the photograph, my thumb tracing the edge of the glass, where time had softened the corners. For a few agonizing seconds, the silence in the room was deafening. My heart weighed heavily in my chest, torn between the ghost of the little boy who used to look up at me with absolute adoration and the callous, arrogant stranger who had just plotted to throw me into a state-funded facility. I set the photograph down, closed my eyes, and pulled out the original trust dossiers. The hesitation vanished, replaced by an unyielding wave of cold, protective clarity. If he couldn't see me as a mother anymore, I would deal with him strictly as the founder of his entire existence. I drove straight to see my legal counsel. When you deal with high net worth assets and luxury estates in the United States, raw emotions don't hold up in a courtroom, but airtight, cold legal structures do. And that was precisely where my foresight as a self-made businesswoman saved me from total devastation. Years prior, when I first purchased that sprawling $8 million suburban estate, I didn't register it in Ethan's name, nor did I leave it unprotected. I placed it, along with several commercial properties and liquid accounts, inside a strictly structured family trust, where I remained the sole owner and absolute authority. When my legal team pulled up the county property deeds and residency records, the reality was stark and unyielding. Under state property law and the precise terms of my trust, Ethan and Chloe were never owners. Not legally, not on paper. They held status strictly as permissive occupants under a temporary license. They were guests, living at the explicit, daily pleasure of the trust owner, holding zero equity and zero legal standing to claim ownership of so much as a single doorknob on that property. My lead attorney, Marcus, looked over my comprehensive notes, closed the heavy manila folder, and leaned back in his leather chair with a firm, reassuring nod. "Eleanor," he said quietly, looking me straight in the eyes, "everything belongs to you. If they've been treating you this way under your own roof, discussing institutionalizing you just to clear up guest space for their friends, you have a documented, severe pattern of elder exploitation and financial abuse. They won't just lose the house, they will drown in legal liability and debt they can't begin to imagine." I nodded slowly, looking out the tinted glass window down toward the busy, gray Boston harbor as the rain pattered against the glass. I reached across his mahogany desk, took the heavy fountain pen from his fingers, and signed the final legal papers. My hand didn't shake, not even a fraction of a millimeter. That absolute steadiness frightened me more than anything else in the world. It proved just how completely my heart had turned to cold, unyielding steel. I hadn't raised my voice during the entire meeting, and I hadn't shed a single tear since that lonely night in the storage room. My son thought he and his wife were the lords of the manor, comfortably planning my exile while sipping wine by the pool. They had no idea that every single wall and every square inch of that $8 million estate was anchored to an immovable legal reality they couldn't touch. The trap wasn't just set, it was locked, bolted, and ready to snap shut, proving once and for all that real power doesn't scream. It signs. 3 weeks after that quiet meeting with Marcus, Ethan and Chloe decided to throw a massive housewarming party. They didn't call it that to me. I was staying at a quiet hotel downtown, letting them believe I was packing my bags elsewhere, but through mutual acquaintances, word traveled fast. They had invited dozens of their closest friends, neighbors, and business associates over to the estate. It was meant to be their grand celebration of complete victory. I watched it all unfold from the back seat of a town car parked just down the street, keeping a live security feed on my tablet. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, I could see Ethan standing by the indoor wet bar, raising a glass of expensive champagne high into the air, while Chloe stood beside him, laughing loudly in a designer dress. Sitting alone in the dim interior of the car, watching the glowing screen on my lap, a strange hollow ache settled deep within my chest. I stared at the face of the boy I had raised, watching him laugh and toast to my supposed exile. For a fleeting second, the heavy grief of a rejected mother threatened to break my resolve. I remembered the countless sleepless nights I spent nursing him through childhood fevers, the sacrifices I made while building my empire, and the crushing irony that he was now celebrating my elimination. But as I watched him casually mock the stubborn old roommate he had traded away for social clout, the grief evaporated, replaced by cold, absolute clarity. They weren't just celebrating a house, they were celebrating my disposal. And tonight, the bill was finally coming due. According to the audio feed piped through a discreet smart home relay, Ethan was holding court in the center of the room, telling anyone who would listen that the property transfer papers were clearing by Monday morning. He even joked, loud enough for half the room to hear, that the old roommate was finally out of their hair for good, packed away into a budget state facility where she belonged. The guests chuckled, raising their glasses. Ethan and Chloe looked like kings of the world, completely drunk on entitlement. They had no idea what was marching up their driveway. At exactly 8 o'clock, right in the middle of Ethan's toast, 2 Black County Sheriff cruisers turned smoothly into the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the evening fog. Right behind them rolled a sleek black sedan carrying Marcus and his team. Inside the house, the laughter suddenly died down. Heads turned toward the front windows. Ethan froze, his champagne glass half raised, staring in utter confusion as the front doorbell echoed loudly through the foyer. A guest near the door swung it open, expecting late-arriving friends. Instead, she was met by 2 uniformed county deputies and Marcus carrying a heavy leather briefcase. Real legal power doesn't raise its voice. It speaks with absolute finality. Marcus stepped past the deputies into the grand entryway, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent living room. "Good evening," Marcus announced, his tone sharp and authoritative. "I am Marcus Vance, legal counsel and executor for Eleanor Vance. We are here on an official enforcement action." Ethan dropped his glass. It shattered against the imported Italian marble floor. He stumbled forward from the bar, his face draining completely of color. What is this? What are you doing in my house? Get out of here right now." "Your house, Mr. Vance?" Marcus stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of embossed legal documents from his folder. "Let me correct you immediately. Under the binding provisions of the Eleanor Vance Revocable Living Trust, this house belongs to Eleanor. You and your wife were merely permissive occupants under a temporary license." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. People began whispering behind their hands, staring at Ethan and Chloe with sudden disbelief. Marcus didn't pause. "Furthermore, due to severe violations of trust bylaws, specifically involving elder exploitation and financial abuse, your temporary right of residency is hereby revoked, effective immediately. You have 2 hours. Leave." Chloe let out a sharp, hysterical shriek, rushing forward. "You can't do this. We're family." "It is entirely legal, Mrs. Vance," Marcus replied coldly, "and all secondary corporate accounts and credit cards linked to the trust are frozen as of this exact second." Right on cue, Chloe's high-end smartphone buzzed in her hand. She looked down at the screen, her eyes widening in sheer terror as text alerts flashed notifying her that every single card had been declined and their accounts had dropped to 0. Her phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the floor. Ethan looked around the room, desperately seeking support from the dozens of high-profile friends and business partners watching them. But one by one, the guests began stepping backward toward the exit. Not a single person stepped forward to defend them. Instead, every single guest deliberately avoided looking Ethan in the eye, quietly grabbing their coats and walking out the front door to distance themselves from the unfolding humiliation. The grand party had turned into an eviction hearing in less than 10 minutes. As I watched the live feed from my town car down the street, seeing my son pale, cornered, and utterly ruined in front of everyone he tried to impress, my heart didn't ache. It felt light. The lesson had finally been delivered. Within minutes, the sprawling $8 million living room transformed from a glittering celebration of high society into a silent, freezing wasteland of exposed lies. The guests didn't just leave, they fled. High-end real estate developers, local politicians, and wealthy socialites who had been laughing and clinking champagne glasses with Ethan just moments before now practically trampled each other to get out the front door. Within 5 minutes, the luxury cars were peeling out of the driveway one by one, leaving behind nothing but crushed cigarette butts, spilled champagne, and a deafening, suffocating silence. And then, the real collapse began. With the crowd gone, Ethan dropped completely to his knees. The proud, arrogant posture he had held all evening vanished in an instant. He hit the polished marble floor with a heavy thud, staring blankly at his empty hands where his high-status life had just slipped through his fingers. He looked up toward the doorway, his eyes wide and bloodshot, calling out a pathetic, desperate plea. "Mom, Mom, please, where are you? Tell them this is a joke. Tell them it's not real." Hearing my only son, a grown man in his 30s, whom I had coddled and shielded from every storm, whining and begging on a cold floor, did something strange to my chest. For a second, I wanted to kneel beside him. My body remembered the little boy who used to hold my hand in the cold winter wind, but my mind remembered the man he had become. He didn't crawl over to me because he missed his mother. He crawled because his credit cards were dead, his house was gone, and he had just realized that for the past 18 years, he had been nothing more than an empty shell propped up entirely by my wealth. Without my money, Ethan was nobody, and he knew it. Before I could even step out from the shadows of the doorway to face him, Chloe snapped. The moment she realized her designer wardrobe, her luxury cars, and her effortless lifestyle were evaporating into thin air, her sweet-talking persona dissolved into pure venom. She spun around, pointing a shaking, manicured finger right down at her husband, her voice screeching across the empty room. "This is all your fault!" Chloe screamed, her face twisted in rage as she glared at Ethan on the floor. "You swore your mother was wrapped around your finger. You swore her money was basically ours. You told me we were safe, you idiot!" Ethan scrambled up from his knees, his face flushing crimson with humiliation and fury. "My fault? You were the one pushing to throw her into a state facility? You were the one complaining about her breathing the air in this house?" "Because you're spineless!" Chloe shrieked back, ripping her diamond imitation bracelet off her wrist and hurling it straight at his head. "You're a leech, a 30-year-old child who couldn't even pay a utility bill without his mommy's credit card." They stood there in the center of that grand, empty room, screaming at each other, tearing away whatever mask of affection they had ever pretended to share. I finally stepped out from the shadows of the foyer, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The shouting instantly cut off. Both of them whipped their heads around, staring at me as if I were a ghost. Ethan's face lit up with a pathetic, desperate glimmer of hope. He scrambled across the floor toward me, his hands outstretched, tears streaming down his face as he clutched at the hem of my coat. "Mom, please, Mom, look at me," he choked out, his voice cracking with ugly, ragged sobs. "I was stupid. I was blind. I messed up so badly. But I'm your son. Please, give me another chance. I'll change. I swear to God I'll change. I looked down at the boy I had given my entire life to. My heart didn't turn to stone. It ached with a deep, quiet sorrow. But beneath that sorrow lay an unyielding, unbreakable wall of clarity. I knew my son better than he knew himself. If I gave in tonight, if I paid off their debts and let them stay, I wouldn't be saving him. Comfort had made him weak. Entitlement had made him cruel. Only hardship could ever teach him how to stand on his own 2 feet. I slowly pulled my coat away from his trembling fingers. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice steady, calm, and final. "No, Ethan," I whispered softly. "You won't change. For 18 years, I gave you everything you ever asked for, and it taught you how to throw your mother away like garbage. Tonight, you finally get what you've earned, the freedom to find out who you really are without my money behind your back." Chloe let out one final bitter gasp while Ethan collapsed back onto the floor, burying his face in his hands as quiet, hopeless weeping echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. I turned around, walked out the front doors into the cool night air, and left them behind in the empty house they thought they owned. For the first time in 58 years, I wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. And for the first time in his life, my son was finally on his own. People often mistake boundaries for hatred. They think that when a mother cuts off financial support, she is slamming the door on her child's heart forever. But they don't understand. Real maternal love isn't about feeding a monster until it destroys everything in its path. Sometimes true love means letting go of the leash so the person can finally learn how to walk. I didn't hate my son. As I stood in that quiet hallway watching him weep, my chest still ached with the heavy, bruised sorrow of a mother who had given her entire life to her child. But I knew that if I picked him up off that floor, if I handed him another check or wiped away his consequences, I would be sealing his permanent destruction. Before I turned to walk out of the house for the final time, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a single small brass key, and laid it gently on the edge of the marble bar right beside the shattered glass. Beside it, I placed a folded piece of paper containing printed listings for entry-level jobs across the city, warehouse packing, local delivery services, and retail customer support. Ethan stopped crying for a second, staring up at the key with wide, terrified eyes. What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he looked between the brass key and me. I looked down at my son, not with anger, not with contempt, but with a deep, quiet steadiness. "That is the key to a small studio apartment on the edge of the city," I said, my voice calm and unwavering. "It's paid for through the end of next month. There are no maids, no luxury cars, and no hidden trust funds to bail you out. And that list beside it, those are places looking for people willing to work 40 hours a week for an honest hourly wage." Ethan scrambled to his feet, staring at the small key as if it were a death sentence. "Mom, no, please. You can't expect us to live like that. We don't know how to survive without—" "I know," I interrupted softly. "For 18 years, I gave you everything you ever asked for, wrapping you in a cushion of wealth so thick you never had to feel the weight of the real world. But today, my part is done. Now, it is time for me to return you to reality so you can finally learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." Chloe stood by the window, her face pale, her jaw trembling in silent horror as the full, unyielding weight of our new reality settled over the room. There was no escape hatch, no cards to swipe, and no mother to rescue them from the consequences of their own greed. 3 days later, the transition played out exactly as the law intended. They packed their remaining clothes into cheap nylon duffel bags, loaded them into a beaten-down second-hand sedan, and drove away from the $8 million gates they had taken for granted. The transition wasn't pretty. The first few weeks were an absolute war zone of shouting and bitter adaptation. Chloe couldn't handle the cramped kitchen and eventually packed her remaining bags, walking out on Ethan entirely to chase someone else with deep pockets, proving once and for all that her loyalty was never to him, but to a lifestyle. Left entirely alone in that tiny studio apartment, faced with 4 bare walls and an empty refrigerator, Ethan had to face the brutal reality of surviving on his own. The process was agonizingly slow and messy. On his very first day at the distribution warehouse, he messed up shipping manifests, dropped a heavy crate, and was sharply chewed out by a manager who didn't care who his mother was. He came home with his back burning, his shoulders locked in a tight, stabbing spasm, and his hands raw from handling rough cardboard boxes. For the first time in his life, there was no maid to clean his clothes, leaving him standing over a plastic basin in the tiny bathroom, awkwardly scrubbing sweat-soaked shirts by hand while cursing under his breath in frustration. He stumbled, he failed, and he spent many nights lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling and regretting every arrogant choice that brought him there. I heard about those struggles weeks later from Marcus, who discreetly checked in on the legal proceedings. He told me that one evening, after finishing another grueling 10-hour shift, his hands blistered and his back aching, Ethan had sat on the edge of his cheap mattress, staring down at his calloused palms. He hadn't called to demand money. He had simply broken down and wept the quiet, cleansing tears of a man who was finally waking up to the truth. He had earned every blister on his hands. For the first time in 30 years, every dollar in his pocket was truly his own. Today, the estate is quiet again. I sit by the living room window in the mornings, drinking my coffee in the peaceful silence I had always dreamed of. There are no corporate spreadsheets to audit, no emergency credit card alerts to approve, and no invisible burdens to carry. For the first time in 58 years, I am simply breathing for myself. My door remains open to my son, but only to the man he is slowly, painfully learning to become. The illusion is gone. The gold has turned to iron, and out of the ashes of entitlement, a real life was finally saved. Looking back at the woman I used to be, the mother who believed that wrapping her child in absolute comfort was the ultimate proof of love, I finally understand the tragic mistake I made. Years ago, holding a tiny infant in my arms in a freezing hospital room while vowing that he would never feel a single harsh wind, I whispered a promise to myself. No child of mine will ever know this cold. I thought I was protecting him. Instead, I was starving his soul, stripping him of the resilience every human being needs to survive. Now, sitting in the quiet sunlight of my living room, watching the dust motes dance across the polished floor, I finally understand the truth. Children don't need a life without hardship. They need parents who teach them how to survive it. The gold I poured over my son's life was soft, fragile, and utterly useless when real life struck. But the iron forged in those months of struggle, that is real strength. That is a real legacy. And out of the ashes of an empire built on blind indulgence, a true family was finally saved. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag, drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.